Welcome to Consciously Cannabis. I'm Carly, host of Consciously Clueless, the podcast bringing you this series. Together with guests, I'll be exploring cannabis through lenses of sustainability, mindfulness, and plant-based living. Bonus content from Consciously Cannabis will be available at patreon.com/consciouslycarly. Take a hit, or don't, all are welcome here, and let's get lit.
I'm stoked to be on.
So your Instagram handle is Cannabichem. I'm saying that right?
So it's like cannabis and chemistry put together into Cannabichem. And honestly, if I were to make a new Instagram, like if I were starting from day one, I would not have put Canna in my name. That is just asking, that's just asking for it from step one. So I would definitely take that out. And I tried changing it back, and then everyone told me not to do that. So if you're an aspiring content creator, do not put canna, do not put marijuana, do not put weed, do not put smoke, do not put any of those terms in your name.
Can you share why?
Oh, just the censorship on the internet. Yeah. And a lot of it is because these social media companies may actually think that cannabis is incredibly harmful, or maybe it's just other people paying them to keep this information off. But you'll notice if you try to use hashtags, that's a good way to tell what's being censored and what's not. So if you look for the hashtag cannabis, weed, smoking, joint, THC,
they just like don't pop up.
Yeah, they just don't exist because they're not allowed to exist. And so anything you create around those similar hashtags is similarly censored in that way. So especially if you have it in your name, everything you post ever is going to be flagged. So yeah.
The name is great. I really do appreciate it. But yeah, I can see how that would maybe become a problem with the whole algorithm.
Yeah, controlling our lives, but it's okay. Yeah, I still like the name a lot, so I'm gonna keep rocking with it.
It's great. So how did we get to Cannabichem? What was the inspiration for that, maybe that name, and even starting this page?
Oh yeah, I didn't really have any inspo for the name, but for the page, it started when I was in grad school and I was researching medicinal plants. So I didn't really start with cannabis. I started with many different traditionally used medicinal plants and medicinal fungi, other natural products. And I've been a stoner since I was like 14 years old. Weed has always reacted with my body so positively, and it's made me feel just like normal and functional. And it's just been a staple in my day to day for so long. I don't hide that. I'm not scared of it. So even if we are studying other medicinal plants, I was always known as the stoner, the one who loved cannabis, the one who loved researching it, reading about it, and using it. And I was eventually I was at the University of Rhode Island, and they were making a cannabis certification course, and they needed a TA for it. So when I was a grad student, I was the TA for that course. And I really excelled in that position because that's really where like passion came through. I love teaching, but I love cannabis so much too. I was making videos to help teach the class, and that was not required of me. I was just like, wow, they need another resource. I'll do it. So I started recording Zooms. I started, providing additional resources. And then one day it just hit me like, why do students have to pay $7,000 to learn how cannabis works in their body? Like, why isn't that free? And so once I really had that epiphany, it was right at the same time COVID was starting and TikTok was starting to come up, and we had to leave the lab. We had to go home. And I was like, I don't really know what to do at home. So I started making TikTok videos talking about how cannabis works in the body, talking about the chemistry of cannabis, just talking about these kind of next level things that so many people who are cannabis consumers, they crave that knowledge. We want that knowledge because it really helps us be better advocates for ourselves and our medicine. But we didn't really have a resource for that was tangible to general consumers. So I created a TikTok channel. I called it Cannabichem. Again, I don't know why. I think I just typed it in and said, cool, it's not taken. And I took it. And yeah, started making videos. And like the first one just blew up and like
Damn.
immediately and this was early TikTok though. This is like when there wasn't a ton of people creating content. It was early. It was like a whole different world. And yeah, it gained traction really fast. And honestly, there was less censorship at this time too. I could say cannabis, I could say THC, I could talk about it pretty openly. I was still getting some videos removed, but it's a different beast now. It's still totally possible to provide that education. We just need to take slightly different angles at it now and just learn from feedback that we get from the internet.
I so appreciate that approach because it's like with any of these conversations, that knowledge out of the ivory tower, right? And being like, wait a second, everyone should have this information. And I love that you said, okay, I'm going to give it to them then.
Oh, and then there's a whole nother tier to this because all of my research background had been like very traditional academic research, right? That's the only way I thought about research. And once you really start to go on social media and you start to talk to these larger communities of people, you start to realize that the knowledge is within the cannabis industry. It's within the consumers. Like so much knowledge is just already there, but we've never had a method of trust or communication between the ivory tower of academia and the general consumer. So being able to harness that knowledge and like better represent the cannabis consumer, better design experiments and better ask the probing questions that matter and really get to the bottom of how this is a medicine. Yes, from a chemistry standpoint, but also from a spiritual and a wellness standpoint, because this does matter. That is what makes it a sustainable medicine to use every day. It is incorporated into our life and our spirituality. And that's really important to highlight, especially in research. Like it is important for the compliance to the medicine, and it's important for feeling that community around your medicine because it really makes you use it in a more intentional way and have an avenue to discuss with other people who also like to utilize that medicine in a similar way.
So since you are crusading through this and saying, I want this information to be available for more people and have the information, like you said, from consumers that already know so much, keep sharing that. What pushback are you getting in academia or in some of those research spaces? Because I don't have my PhD, but I have my master's, and I can imagine some of those spaces bringing up weed. I wasn't even researching it, but I would have been uncomfy in some of those spaces to talk about, yeah, I smoke every night.
Yeah, they definitely look at us differently for sure. Like when we go to conferences, again, this is what we do. And cannabis is so ingrained in our lifestyle that we will walk outside of a conference and smoke weed right there. That's how strong we feel about this medicine. Like we're not trying to hide it. So yeah, we do get looks from a lot of researchers, and people on LinkedIn have given us some pushback saying that it
Sorry,
doesn't.
I don't know why that was so funny. People
like
on LinkedIn.
I clash so hard with people on LinkedIn. Like I really, I understand it's an important professional space, but like I really struggle on that platform. Anyway, so yeah, we've gotten some pushback here and there, but I will say there's so many researchers in academia who are reaching out to us and saying, we understand that the research we're doing is not relevant. It does not capture what the cannabis consumer is experiencing. And we want your help. We want to do research with you. We want to partner with you. And I think that's part of what makes it so much more legitimate is we're not just doing community data or we're not just doing laboratory data. We are collecting data. I say we. I'm a co-founder in a nonprofit, research and education nonprofit called the Network of Applied Pharmacognosy, or NAP. And essentially the research we do is a huge diversity of research. Some of it's in the laboratory and looking at the actual enzymes involved in your body in the endocannabinoid system and understanding how different strains or cultivars interact with your body differently and what that might mean for people with different types of brains, whether that's autism or ADHD, different neurotypes. But we're also doing the community data where we're collecting data from our community and asking, what are you doing? What are you already doing? Because we've never collected this data. But that's because there's never been trust between consumers and researchers where people don't want to share. If somebody from the government comes and goes, hey, you mind telling me all about your cannabis use? Like, I do mind, actually. Like, that doesn't sound fun to me. But if you have an independent research company who are open stoners and advocates for this medicine, you feel a lot more comfortable sharing that data with them and sharing your information and saying, I'm going to be honest on this survey. And I'm actually going to say, I use cannabis and drive. I was pregnant and used cannabis. I use cannabis every morning before work. Whatever it is, people are definitely honest. It shows in our data. Like, we're showing numbers that like nobody knew existed within our community, but they do, and they represent real people. And we need to start using that information to advocate for the use of cannabis in everyday life.
So how has the landscape of being able to even research this, because so much has happened in the last few years, specifically rescheduling, descheduling, all those conversations. And I hear so many people say, we haven't been able to research it. We haven't been allowed to. So what is that landscape now, and how has that changed, or is it changing?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not changing much. We're still going to struggle studying THC in the laboratory. We can still study the other 400 compounds in the plant. We can understand that, but we can't study THC in the laboratory. And I think there's a misconception that if cannabis were to be rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, that this would open up so many more avenues for research. And it may for a subset of academics who now feel just a little less apprehensive to dive into the waters of cannabis. But at the end of the day, there was a bill passed in 2022 that essentially said, no matter what schedule cannabis is, no matter what it's classified as, researchers still need to go through the DEA, and they get final call on who gets to research this plant at what university and where they buy their reagents from, or their different chemical compounds from. So there's still a heavy amount of control, like a lot of control over studying this. So like for us in the laboratory, we have to essentially use cannabis extracts that are absent of THC, of delta-9 THC, but we could still use something like delta-8 THC, which is why we have so much information on delta-8 THC. Yeah, it's cool that we've been able to do that for research purposes, but I think we really need to just allow people to study the real THC that's occurring in the plant, delta-9 THC. That's the most relevant to people. And then another thing is, researchers still aren't able to study any of the actual products that are available in dispensaries. Like the most relevant products, and you can't just go into a dispensary like with this government funded money and purchase cannabis products. You have to go through these like 3 universities that grow cannabis that is genetically more like hemp than it is like marijuana or type 1 THC cannabis. And it just doesn't represent the consumer experience. And that's what we're missing, is like this practical, tangible research on the products that all of us can go and purchase and then put into our body. And the fact that we're still so limited in studying that, I think that says a lot about the logistics of what's going on behind the scenes with our government and controlling the amount of research we have on this plant.
And yeah, I'm probably a conversation for another podcast episode, but just like the research and control in general.
Oh my gosh. And it's all about control. It's not about safety. If you look at
Money.
any of the data, it's money. Yeah, it's money and control at the end of the day. And I use this example all the time, but I'm a natural product chemist. I grow so many plants in my garden that could easily kill a person, easily kill a person. And
Watch out.
I'm not legally allowed to cultivate a medicinal
Right.
plant that's been used for thousands of years, that has no documented deaths from cannabis use alone. Again, make it make sense. Show me the data. Nothing makes sense. This is clearly about money and control. And I think that's why it's so scary to the government, is because we can grow this planet. I understand from a perspective of the government and maybe healthcare companies why they might not want to promote it, but it's really unfortunate for the people of this country that could have the most accessible home healthcare for at least preventative medicine, and we just don't allow it.
When you have been sharing, I notice you're using the word stoner, and that word, I'm wondering if it's an intentional choice, because there's some stereotypes that go around with that word. And so someone has a PhD and is researching this saying, yeah, I'm a stoner, I think is an interesting juxtaposition for people.
Yeah, and it's funny, I used to work at a company and they really encouraged us to stop using that word, and we were like, absolutely not. It's like an advocacy term at this point. But stoners are daily cannabis users that, or frequent cannabis users, that cannabis really reacts well with your body, and it is your medicine, right? And I think it's had a negative connotation for so long because we've had a negative outlook on what cannabis is and what a daily consumer is. But that's not how I think about it. And I think we have the opportunity to reframe how we think of the word stoner, as we have people who are doctors, lawyers, or just a biologist, anybody out there that just has a job that might be seen in the light as very professional, but saying, yeah, I'm a stoner. It makes people reframe their thinking around that word. And I do think it's important to say, and we actually, on our nonprofit, we're about to release a merch line that says stoner science breaks the stigma. And that's essentially what we do.
Yes.
We do stoner science in more ways than one, right? We actually study the stoner community. We study daily consumers to understand a little more about how this medicine works in the body and how people are using this medicine. But we also do some specific experiments that are just to engage cannabis users in science, because we don't always want it to be like the super high level, like nobody understands the paper we're writing, and that's not accessible science. So like we've done projects in the past. I think my favorite is Roaches for Research, where we collected roaches from a cannabis event. And for listeners who don't know, a roach is the like end of a cannabis joint that's like mostly burned. We collected those and we analyzed the chemistry of how like roach chemistry is different than normal chemistry, because that is cool. Like people smoke roaches, they understand it feels a little different. I don't know if you ever heard of a century joint, but a century joint is when you take all of your roaches, you empty them and you put them into a new joint and you smoke a century joint. And the chemistry is really different between a roach and a fresh cannabis joint. Because if you think about it, as you're smoking, you're pulling hot air through that cannabis. And it's essentially vaporizing the weed before you smoke the weed because you're pulling hot air through. So even if that portion of the joint doesn't reach the ember or the flame, it still has a lot of changes happening. Like a lot of your smelly terpenes are going to lose, like they're going to be left to the air, or maybe you'll suck them into your body. So there's going to be heavier terpenes left. There's going to be less THC, more CBN. And this is the cool stoner chemistry that is relevant to your daily life, but also fun to share and fun to learn about because it's like approachable, applicable science.
This is so fun. I forgot I was interviewing you. I was like, yes, tell me more stoner science. I was like, whoa, the roaches, what?
Roaches are so cool. And it's like, that's the other thing. You wouldn't know to even look into that unless you were a
Right.
stoner. And you said, I've smoked roaches before. Yeah, that's a different experience. And now we have the ability to look at it in the laboratory. And actually for that one, because we can't study THC in our lab, we just used a local compliance lab that you would use if you were submitting a sample to be on the shelf at a dispensary.
Oh, interesting. So the narrative around we can't study it, so we're doing all these things over here and over here. And I know that some consumers have that on their radar. They're like, yeah, that's the narrative. Like they can't research it yet. Is there anything consumers do or that you're working on to push that possibility further along? What are things we can do or that you're doing that help us be able to research THC?
Oh, that's a good question. I love action items. There's actually a public period coming up, public comment period for the rescheduling of cannabis. And I think that ends in the end of June, but I double check me on that one. And essentially, the public has the opportunity to say if they support rescheduling cannabis or not. And even if your comment said, I do or don't support rescheduling, and I would like to see the ability to research cannabis more, that would be an important part of that, because the bill that was passed that inhibits a lot of the research, that's a much easier thing to get around than rescheduling or descheduling or whatever that is, because that was a much smaller bill. And the purpose of it was to increase the amount of researchers and the types of research, but they really haven't done what they said they were going to do. Instead, they just inhibited research and took control over who gets to do the research. So I think that public period, they legally have to read every single page that comes through that says that if you support it or if you don't. So I think that would be a really important time. And it's good to also voice your opinion on rescheduling, because that's also important.
That's a great example, and maybe I can find that information and throw it in the show notes for folks as well.
Cool. Yeah, that'd be great.
So you have a podcast as well. I'd love to hear a little bit about that, and I'm excited to dive in more to the show. I've only listened to a couple, but the stoner science and all these conversations, it's real fun.
Yeah, so the podcast is called the Bioactive Podcast, and it's essentially about how cannabis works in the body and a few other natural products that I like to mix in there. I think it's important, especially to know that cannabis is a tool, but there's a lot of other really cool natural products that also work really well for a lot of different mental and physical conditions. So I like to force people into that knowledge by making it mostly about cannabis and then sprinkling in a few other things. But yeah, I have a lot of guests on from the industry. And then my business partner, Dr. Miyabi Shields, I have regular episodes with them. Those are called nap time episodes. We talk about the research we're doing with the nonprofit and like fun events that we go to, because we go to a lot of really cool cannabis industry events. And we just like to use it as an audio journal because it's so fun and hilarious. A lot of other people do too. It's not just us listening. Then there's also regular episodes with my husband, who's a wildlife biologist. And he talks about essentially during each season, like what's going on outside, what changes are we seeing? Why are moose and deer losing their antlers this time of year? Or how do you forage for this specific mushroom? How do you find a good habitat for that? So it's also more tangible information for people who want to go outside more, be more of an outdoors person, but might have a barrier, might be a little scared of getting out there because it could be intimidating.
I love that. I really appreciate that, and that you sneak in the other things. That's
Yeah.
actually what I feel like I'm doing with this Consciously Cannabis series, is just like this monthly series on my podcast that's about veganism and sustainability. And I'm like, and cannabis now, because
And
Minnesota it's
also,
legal. Just you're gonna get this newsletter once a month about cannabis as well.
I love it though. I love the more diverse people that can incorporate cannabis somehow into their career. Like now it's a cannabis nursing is like a subset of nursing.
Mm,
Awesome. And just anyone who can just,
wow.
yeah. And if we can just talk about it in all these different sectors of people who do different things and hang out in different communities, that's really what sends the message from a community level, is showing how many diverse people enjoy the same medicine.
What is research or things going on right now that you've seen recently that you're really excited about?
Oh, I think all the research that Abstracts Tech is doing, I think they're doing some of the coolest research. So they study the smells of cannabis, like all the different smells. And we always said terpenes, right? Terpenes are responsible for the smells. You have your piney terpenes, you have your lavender-like terpenes, you have all of these different things. And that's why different weed smells different. But they're now understanding that there are so many more smelly molecules than just terpenes. And some of them I think are so interesting. They're called indole and scatol. And scatol is what is responsible for the smell of poop, of poopy smell, is scatol. And that molecule is found in some varieties of cannabis that smell like really savory. Part of that savory smell is the poopy smell. Like the weed just naturally makes scatol, which also is very structurally similar to DMT and might be responsible why some strains give you that feeling of mysticism while others don't.
Wow, I didn't know where we were going, but that is not where I would have predicted, which I love. Life is unpredictable, but damn,
Crazy. Yeah, literally.
that's wild.
Yeah,
What?
that's one example, but there's so many different smells that they've identified in cannabis for the first time ever. And actually our nonprofit is now working with them with a few research projects, and we're the biggest fangirls over them. We're just like, you guys are like doing the coolest science. If there's any canna nerds out there, definitely follow Abstracts with an X Tech on Instagram.
That's a hot tip. That's really fun. I love that. And
Yeah.
so what then if someone's listening and they're like, okay, so what are you doing with that information? Why do I
The
need to know
smelly
that?
The
Yeah,
smells,
yeah.
yeah. Definitely helping us profile cannabis strains better, right? Like
Mm,
we need a way, we need a better way to tell people what weed they're getting. Because right now, indica sativa hybrid is, we've had so many papers come out that say that there's no meaning behind that. Like, we've looked at the different profiles, the chemical profiles of the classic or the indicas and the sativas and the hybrids, and they all overlap. There's no like distinction between them. So we need a better way of telling consumers what they're getting. So using this more complex chemistry of getting, okay, now you have your THC, your CBD, your other cannabinoids. We have terpene profile. We've had that for a while. And now we can also layer on these other smells, which they call flavorants. If we can create a way to map this so consumers can better understand what varieties they like, what they gravitate towards, and how to identify that when they're shopping, I think that's where all of that research comes in the most handy. Because have you ever heard the nose, that term in cannabis? Yeah. So
Yeah.
the nose
Is that
is
real?
essentially, it is real.
Okay, I was
100%
gonna
is real.
say the first time I went into a dispensary in Colorado, that's what the guy told me, and I've been on that since. I'm like, that guy told me the nose. So literally, it was like
No,
a
he's
skit.
right.
He was like, just follow your nose, girls. That was my experience. I was like, totally.
That is so funny. But it's true. Your nose has over 400 different smell receptors. And when you smell a variety of cannabis, you can typically tell if that's something you want to dive into or try. You're very curious about it, you're attracted to it. Or sometimes you smell things and you're like, yeah, I don't smell anything special here. Ew, that smells gross. I don't want that at all. Gravitate towards the ones you want, because the smell receptors in your nose, they link to biochemical pathways in your body. And if you smell something and your body's telling you to go towards that, it's listening to a craving of food, or like smelling some foods and being like, ooh, yeah, I really want pasta right now, but I definitely don't want a banana, or whatever. You're smelling these different things. Your body knows what it wants and what it craves. And we don't really understand that fully, but we do understand that different noses react differently to different cannabis strains. Most people react better to strains that their nose reacts positively to. And that's really the research that they're doing, is this really complex aroma of cannabis. Because if we were to just look at terpenes alone, we say again, pinene, limonene, linalool, these compounds. If it was really just the terpene, then we should be able to go smell a pine tree or smell some lavender and have that same
Right.
reaction and affinity, and we don't. Cannabis smell is so complex, and we're like just diving in to what makes the different strains more or less complex and more or less medicinal for some people.
It's wild because I intellectually know, as we just talked about it, right? The lack of research and all of that. And still, when you're saying these things, I'm like, I can't believe that we're just figuring some of this shit out, right? Or we're just being allowed to. I want to say it's, oh, wow, maybe we should take a look at this. That part's not new, but it's wild that you're like, we're just diving in, and people have been smoking for a long ass time.
Yes. And I do think part of this, like, I'm going to say my research is cool here too, because I think our research in abstracts and other people are able to now do this cool research because our industry has matured enough. This research is coming from within the industry. This is not coming out of an academic lab. This is not grant funded research. This is coming from a lab within the cannabis industry who understands cannabis and understands what to look for in cannabis. And I think that's so important. I think we rely on academic labs a lot, especially for medically related information. And I think that's still absolutely the place for a lot of that research to happen. But when we're looking at studying these different strains or cultivars, we're starting to understand the aromatic profile, or what types of products do we use in research? Is it hash rosin, or is it flower, or is it distillate? A lot of academics don't know what those three words mean, but people who love to rip dabs absolutely know what hash rosin is and what the difference is between hash rosin and live resin. And that sort of nuance for researchers is so important for having a successful research project.
That's so interesting. And as these things keep unfolding, it's so entangled with the the war on drugs, these laws, all of this interconnected,
Yeah.
intersectional works that feel like the research and all of it must just be so entangled that all of it needs to fall.
Absolutely. And we also like always need collaborations. And I think that's what's so important and like why we always want to work with as many people as possible. And you see these other successful research companies doing the same thing. You can't be good at everything. And if you try to be good at everything, you're not going to be good at anything. Having different research industries or companies that kind of really focus on a certain sector, like Abstracts is really focusing on smell. We're focusing on the consumer experience and the enzymes in the endocannabinoid system. And then other researchers are doing other stuff. And then we collaborate, we share data, we go to conferences, we publish together. Some of us smoke together. We share information that way, and we build in like much greater ways than if we were all just trying to silo our own research.
I've been so struck with different conversations I've had for this series about how cannabis historically has links to queer movements and to people of color. All of these marginalized fringe parts of society all end up being like, fuck this, we should probably work together. And I think that I've only seen that happen, it seems, more and more in this industry.
Oh, yeah. And part of that movement, I think that's happening right now, or at least in our world, is the neurodivergent movement. Like
Yeah.
we realize from our research data and from even the reasons why we started our company and why a lot of people can't fit into the square box of the traditional ways of corporate America, right? And part of that reason might be cannabis use, honestly, and the need for this medicine multiple times a day. And that's why a lot of people in our industry have gravitated here, because we do love this plant and we want to
Mm,
represent it and we want to be surrounded by it, right? So part of what we do for advocacy is encouraging the cannabis industry to make sure that the employees within the cannabis industry have access to
yes.
cannabis use during the day. And of course, there might be a few positions where that's just not practical. But for a lot of other positions, the reason we should not have to hire cannabis use within the cannabis industry, we should be the number one advocates for accessibility of this medicine. And that starts with workplace accessibility. So that's something we're really passionate about talking about, is the intersection of neurodivergence and entrepreneurship and employment in
Mm,
the cannabis industry, and kind of this overlap and understanding how to better retain neurodivergent employees, or for people who are neurodivergent, what business resources can we help you with that can help you be a successful cannabis business owner. So there's a diversity of ways you can go about that, but that's really our focus right now, is the neurodivergence movement.
going back just a little bit to something you said in the beginning, you shared that you've been a stoner since 14. When you were smoking as a younger person, were you, I want to work in like this, I want this to be my job? Or was that something, like you said, you were studying other plants and you're like, I smoke it, I should study it?
Yeah, I don't know why, but I never even thought about the cannabis industry as a potential
No one's really
career for
talking
me.
about that at like career fairs.
No, really. And it's like, I didn't know anybody in the cannabis industry. I
Right.
didn't know much about it. It was just ancillary space that I knew nothing about. So yeah, I was just like, I thought I was always just going to work with medicinal plants and continue to be a stoner who loved medicinal plants. Turns out there's a perfect industry for that, and it's the cannabis industry.
Well, I love that you found it because it's so beautiful. What drew me to your page and wanting to talk to you is that it's nothing but authentic. It's nothing but passion and care and just a love for the plant. And that's so clear that you're exactly where you should be.
Thank you. Yeah. And I love sharing it too, because I always have these moments where I'm like, whoa, that's the coolest thing in the world. But now I can just pull out my phone and record it. And it's so funny. So many people call my videos authentic. And I think part of the reason is because I like always use like first or second take. Like I do not record a lot, just because they get progressively worse for me if I keep recording. So it's
Same.
if I don't nail it like first try, it's just not happening. Like I'll just put away my phone and say the vibes weren't right today.
You're
So
stronger than me because I know that, but I'll do 8. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe I'll get better.
Oh, they just look so much more like rehearsed as you go through, and it's literally robotic. I really appreciate that. And that's part of the goal too, is it to be like a conversation and not
Right.
like me in a white coat preaching at everyone on the internet and saying, I know more about weed than you do. It's more of, yo, I just found out something really cool. Do you want to learn about it? Or, hey, have you ever wondered why this strain doesn't give you the munchies and this one does? Here's why. It's just a
Right.
conversation. I've always hated the vibe of academia being just so hierarchical and like preachy. And I never want to make people feel dumb. Never, ever a goal.
I think you do a great job of calling people in to the conversation. And I'm already in, so maybe I have a biased opinion, but I think you genuinely do a really lovely job, and that's clear from your content.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Do you have anything you want to share with listeners that I haven't given you space to do so before we do a little Patreon only exclusive?
Yeah, I think just I hope more people can be more proud of their cannabis use and not have to hide it in the future. And that's a goal with everything we do. And if you're in a position to be proud of it and share it, then I encourage you to do so.
I appreciate that. If you have a few minutes and want to hang out to smoke for Patreon, I would thoroughly enjoy that.
Oh, 100%.
Thanks for listening to an episode of Consciously Cannabis. If you're not ready for this episode to be over, don't worry. Every Consciously Cannabis episode has bonus content. Sometimes guests and I will smoke together. Maybe you'll see some of my friends and I toke up. Who knows? Go to patreon.com/consciouslycarly and get all the bonus content. And thank you so much for listening to this new series. If you enjoyed it, remember to hit subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. Share it with a friend. Tell someone you know. Anything helps, and I so appreciate it. See you next time.